Multiple times in my emails, in my DMs, in events, I'm asked, Sim, how do I overcome imposter syndrome? How do I deal with imposter syndrome? And not gonna lie, until very recently, I used to talk openly about imposter syndrome, but recently I've taken a little bit of a U-turn on the term imposter syndrome itself. This video is about why I think the term imposter syndrome, particularly in professional circumstances, is inherently problematic. In all honesty, I think it's a cop-out term that really cleverly distracts attention from the real problem that is happening and arising in the workplace. By way of introduction, my name is Simranjeet Mann. I'm a trainee solicitor for a UK top 20 law firm, and I make videos about law, careers, personal development, as well as vlogging my journey to becoming a solicitor and beyond. Now, let me start off with a little disclaimer before I start in with the juicy stuff. In no way am I invalidating your feelings or feeling like a fraud, because I'm pretty sure for those of you who are watching, if you're watching this video, we have all been there. So in no way am I invalidating that feeling that you've been feeling or saying, you know, you can't be feeling that. It's definitely not like that. I'm simply positing an idea to reframe the narrative. And in a world of cancel culture, especially as a content creator, it can be a little bit scary to go against the grain and go against the norm and put out ideas out there that may not be seen as the norm. But you know what? I woke up today and I chose violence. So that's the way I'm gonna go. Right, so let's start off with the background to imposter syndrome. So imposter syndrome was actually labeled imposter phenomenon, I can't say it. The imposter phenomenon was originally discovered by two psychologists, Pauline Clance-Rose and Suzanne Imes. And their definition of the imposter phenomenon was, it's used to designate an internal experience of intellectual phoniness that appears to be particularly prevalent and intense among a select sample of high-achieving women. So their study was very much focused on high-achieving women. They further stated that despite outstanding academic and professional accomplishments, women who experience the imposter phenomenon persist in believing that they're not really bright and have fooled anyone who thinks otherwise. And their findings have had a really great impact in terms of raising awareness for this feeling of, like, you know, you're a fraud and you don't deserve to be there at a certain place or at an interview or in a workplace, etc. And they've really kind of opened up certain initiatives and programs. Now, of course, their 1978 study was focused on women. However, we now know that men and women can both experience imposter syndrome, and this spans over various ethnic and racial groups. Now, when it came to giving advice on how to deal with imposter syndrome, some of the advice that people would typically give is read a book or attend webinars and talks about imposter syndrome or talk about your feeling to other people. One thing that was recommended that I did personally was recite my achievements and accomplishments over in my head. Some people do this in front of the mirror. I personally did it in my head. And whenever I was feeling like I was a fraud or, you know, I had that intellectual phoniness, I would essentially say, you know, Sim, look at what you've done. You've done this, this, and this to get this far. So when I used to go to events and people used to ask me, Sim, how do you deal with imposter syndrome? That was a main piece of advice that I used to give. But let's actually think about why those feelings of intellectual phoniness actually arise in the first place. So what I want you guys to do right now is pause the video and actually reflect on a time where you felt like you were a fraud or you didn't deserve to be at a certain place or position that you're at right now. So I hope you've done that little pausing exercise, no cheating. Let me talk about my experiences with this phenomenon and how I think my feelings of intellectual phoniness actually arose. So personally, I felt like I had that intellectual phoniness because when I went to assessment centres, when I went to interviews, I didn't see anyone who looked like me, who spoke like me. And then I'd be sat there thinking, how in hell am I going to compare to these people around me who are nothing like me? They look nothing like me. They speak completely differently. And yeah, I just felt like, wow, I'm such a fraud. Like, I don't even deserve to be here. I felt like a phony at networking events because someone looked at my oversized blazer and they really kind of had this look on their face of, it just wasn't a nice look. You know when girls do that look when they look you up and down like, it was exactly like that. So it wasn't a comfortable feeling, and from that I didn't feel like I deserve to be at that networking event, for example. And then further in the workplace, when you experience things like microaggressions that make you feel further like a fraud in the workplace, because you just feel like you don't deserve to be there, when not only are microaggressions either being directed at you, but also other people who may belong to your background or who may be of different ethnic backgrounds, and you just feel like, wow, if it's happening to them, then it might happen to me. And all these experiences have collectively somehow deposited itself in my brain at a certain point, where I felt like, you know what, I'm in a career where I will not belong, where I will always be seen as that imposter. Now, from my examples, I'm obviously talking about a perspective of coming from a certain underrepresented community. However, this isn't something that can only occur to people who are from different racial or ethnic backgrounds. For example, in the workplace, things like being overtly loud or extroverted is seen as something that's celebrated and that's aligned with competence. So therefore, someone who is shy or reserved may feel like they're an imposter or they don't deserve to be in the workplace, because those kind of loud traits are what's celebrated. Similarly, if you're part of the LGBTQ+ community, you may feel like a fraud in a workplace that really encourages heteronormativity. So it's important to note that this feeling of not belonging or feeling like an imposter is something that nearly all of us have felt, regardless of which background you're from, regardless of gender, regardless of sexuality. And essentially, this feeling of imposter syndrome is therefore a natural reaction from anyone who has come from perhaps a working class background, or is from an underrepresented community, or a community that faces a lot of barriers or obstacles, typically in the professional career. Let me provide you guys with some facts. 45% of sufferers are men and 55% are women. And those aged between 18 to 24 are 19 times more likely to experience imposter syndrome compared to an average adult. In addition, BAME adults are as likely as white people to know what imposter syndrome is. However, 15% of BAME people are more likely to experience it. Those who have been privately educated only account for 7% of the population, yet 65% of senior judges and a similar population of perhaps the cabinet, for example, they went to private schools. Of course, you're going to feel like an imposter just by looking at that stat. So let's get to the crux of the issue. Why does the term imposter syndrome feel problematic in my eyes? For me, it places the burden of responsibility on the person who is undervalued or is excluded or is part of that underrepresented community. So albeit I've had situations in my past that have exacerbated my feelings of feeling like a phony in the professional sphere, it's up to me to deal with it. I read an article that basically summarized why imposter syndrome was problematic in one sentence. It stated, "It's making people blame themselves for deep structural unfairness." Like, make it make sense. If someone, okay, let's give a little simple analogy here. If someone kicked you in the face, of course you're going to feel that pain, right? But then that person says to you, oh, you go and deal with that pain while I'm going to go and just kick other people in the face, so then they can feel the same way that you're feeling. And then we'll all be in a collective cycle where, you all are dealing with your pain and I'm not doing anything about it. So the point I'm trying to make here is the concept of imposter syndrome is very well known, the definition of it, the way people feel when they have imposter syndrome. But what is less explored is why imposter syndrome even occurs in the first place. We acknowledge that we have imposter syndrome, but do our workplaces acknowledge that they may have practices within their firms that exacerbate the issue of someone feeling like a phony? Another article summarized my point on this entirely. They stated that imposter syndrome directs our view towards fixing the people at work, but not fixing the places where these people work. So how certain news channels, for example, use the term casual racism or someone having controversial views. Of course, we all know that they're hiding the fact that this person is basically a racist or they've used a racial slur. And it's basically just sweeping the issue under the carpet and cleverly distracting everyone from what the real issue and problem is. I'd like to believe that I'm someone who has a lot of internal strength. I have a lot of ambition. I have a lot of resistance and drive. But when it comes to things like stereotypes or microaggressions, especially in the workplace, they can push you down. And especially for people like women of color, we're the ones who have rarely met other leaders in our field. So we're the one doing the trailblazing, combined with these feelings of doubt, combined with the microaggressions in the workplace, combined with the stereotyping. So there's a lot of pressure on people from underrepresented communities to bear in the workplace. And then on top of that, imposter syndrome and the term itself not only sweeps the issue under the rug as to what's the underlying issue for why people even feel this way, they also place the onus on us to deal with the effects. A lot of people, again, like I mentioned at the start of this video, a lot of people ask me, how do we deal with imposter syndrome? Well, we recognize that the feelings that we are feeling are moments of doubt. They are combined with nervousness, with pressure, with all these other underlying factors and experiences that you've had in the past. In fact, it's actually now, instead of us having to deal with this imposter syndrome, why not let's question workplaces and organizations about what they can do to help alleviate their employees from feeling imposter syndrome. An environment in the workplace needs to be established that fosters and encourages a variety of leadership styles, not only just encouraging those who are loud or confident, but also those who perhaps may be a lot more reserved than other people. But also these organizations and these environments need to encourage those from really diverse backgrounds and ensuring that they feel included in the workplace as well. We need to move away from a workplace environment that's really kind of Eurocentric, masculine, or heteronormative, in my opinion. Like, come to think of it, many of us, if I'm really being blatant here, many of us are told somewhat implicitly that we do not belong in certain spaces. For example, we are questioned on what is actually deemed professional. Even that concept of what is professional is Eurocentric, it is masculine, and it is heteronormative. And this exacerbates the feeling of not belonging because you're having to hide elements of your natural identity. Now, of course, a lot of my viewers are going to be applying to law firms, so let's talk about law firms specifically. What more can law firms do to help alleviate this feeling of their candidates and their employees feeling this element of phoniness or feeling like they don't belong in certain spaces in the professional sphere? Now, remember when I mentioned earlier that many of us typically do feel like we don't belong in certain workspaces, and we are told this either implicitly or explicitly. One implicit way we are told that we don't belong in workspaces is when we go onto a firm's website and we see everyone who looks the same and they look nothing like us. And it just goes to show that the simplest actions go a long way. Show a diverse culture on your websites at least. Another thing you could do is even introduce rainbow lanyards, so it shows that your employees stand in solidarity with those from the LGBTQ+ community. And I'm talking about the simplest of actions here. This isn't even like the maximum, this is somewhat the bare minimum. Law firms could also perhaps reconsider the way they reject individuals in the process. Of course, we all know that rejections come through thick and fast in the training contract process. Perhaps even an email that is a lot more nicer rather than just saying, unfortunately, we are unable to inform you. Perhaps, I know obviously law firms cannot provide personalized emails to every single individual, but even just a section providing general feedback on where people typically went wrong goes an extra way in terms of providing that human aspect for something that can be quite disappointing to handle. And the reason why I'm talking about rejections here is, for me, rejections played a part in my feeling of feeling like a phony because I felt like I had so many rejections. I felt like even having my trading contract offers, I feel like I didn't deserve them because I'd had so many rejections before. I think law firms also need to recognize that you can't only get talent from Oxbridge or Russell Group universities. You can find talent outside of those universities as well. And I think they really do need to put a lot more effort, even in attending law firms from universities outside of the Russell Group, and really making an effort, as much as they would for any other university within the Russell Group or our Oxbridge, but making an effort for those universities outside of those groups as well. I really do think that law firms need to step up and actually be transparent and acknowledge their gaps in their D&I. It's no good saying, oh, we're part of a D&I charter and, you know, we're part of this group, where are the problems in your firm? Where are the gaps where you feel like you could be more inclusive or you could be more diverse, and tackle that. And lastly, I'd like to say one thing that law firms could do more is actually celebrate all kinds of personality traits. The best leader isn't necessarily going to be the loudest one or the most extroverted one in the room. And more feminine traits like empathy could be more celebrated than the more masculine traits of assertiveness in law firms. So essentially, I would like the whole narrative on imposter syndrome to be reframed. I feel like we shouldn't have to lose elements of our identity or who we are to feel like we belong or feel like we are not frauds in the workplace. And another way we can reframe the narrative is actually perhaps seeing the feeling of a fraud in a more positive light. Let me tell you where I learned that from. So I've been listening to old episodes of Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO. I'm really late to the game. I've just started that podcast. And in that podcast, in I think it's episode 5, he talks about his feelings of feeling like a fraud, and he also refers to the story of another billionaire who's also an entrepreneur and a CEO who also had that feeling of a fraud even when he had made it and he was at the top of the chain. And Stephen Bartlett and this individual, they both stated that when you are feeling like an imposter or you're feeling like a fraud, it's great because that means you are working outside of your comfort zone. And I think that can be said for a lot of us. When we are feeling like a fraud, we are in a situation where we are outside our comfort zone. We are in a situation where perhaps we don't feel like we belong in a workplace because we don't see people like us there, or we're trailblazing for the rest of our community or for the rest of the generation. And I think that really kind of reframed my narrative on how I view this whole thing of imposter syndrome, and made me kind of view it in a more positive manner to deal with it. But also, I think as part of reframing that narrative, it's also really important to acknowledge for organizations and workplaces that the onus isn't only on us to deal with imposter syndrome and feeling like a fraud. The onus is actually on you to ensure that your candidates and your employees cannot feel this way or are prevented from feeling this way as much as they can. Hopefully this video has made sense. Just a bit of I think this is like my first rant on YouTube. You may agree with me, you may not agree with me on what I've said, but recently something that, I just felt like speaking about. And thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all in the next video.